All right, I'm going to be introducing the two speakers this morning, the second pair of speakers, and I will be introducing them both at the outset, and then they will each speak for 30 minutes or so, and we'll open it up to the audience. And both of you, please tell me if I forget something important.
Okay.
In other words, it has not been brought to my attention. So Sheri Kling is a doctoral student in process thought here at the Claremont School of Theology, holds a Master of Theological Studies from the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. Her research includes integrating process theology with the spiritual practice of Jungian dream work to facilitate transformation. She's a member of the American Academy of Religion and is also an accomplished songwriter and recording artist. Okay, Adam Nocek, on my right, your left, is a PhD candidate in the Comparative Literature Department and an instructor in the Comparative History of Ideas program at the University of Washington in Seattle. His work focuses on the relation of living systems to various forms of visual, cinema, animation, architecture, and biotechnological mediation. Nocek has published essays on Whitehead, aesthetics, design, and biotechnology. He is the co-editor of the volume, which is no longer forthcoming because it is out, available for purchase, and contains many great essays, including one by me. Co-edited with Nick Gaskell, titled The Lure of Whitehead, as well as a special issue of the journal Inflections titled Animating Biophilosophy, which also came out this year. So we're going to start with Sheri, and we'll do the usual, but you have 30 minutes, so as of right now, which is 11:04.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
In his foreword to Juan Eduardo Serlot's text entitled A Dictionary of Symbols, Herbert Reed writes that every human, quote, is a symbolizing animal. It is evident that at no stage in the development of civilization has man been able to dispense with symbols, end quote. Though Whitehead sees symbolism to be essential for the higher grades of life, he conversely states that humans are both attracted to and repulsed by symbols because, quote, hard-headed men want facts and not symbols. For Whitehead, the advance of civilization required that humans reject the superstitious symbols of their savage past because he saw symbols as uncontrollable, like wild vegetation that could overwhelm humanity. Yet even he must acquiesce to the truth that, quote, however you may endeavor to expel it, symbolism, like nature, ever returns. Symbolism is no mere idle fancy or corrupt degeneration. It is inherent in the very texture of human life. Language itself is a symbolism. Mankind, it seems, has to find a symbol in order to express itself. Indeed, expression is symbolism. Whitehead writes that the human mind is functioning symbolically when some components of its experience elicit consciousness, beliefs, emotions, and usages respecting other components of its experience. The former set of components are the symbols, and the latter set constitute the meaning of the symbols, end quote. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung agrees that symbols are powerful. He drew a distinction between symbols and signs, defining signs as representation of known things. For example, in the way a company's trademark represents the company itself. A symbol, on the other hand, is not the logical equivalent of that to which it refers, but, quote, points beyond itself to an unknown, end quote. In a symbol, the known and unknown, the real and unreal, are joined. If it were only real, writes Jung, it would not be a symbol, for it would then be a real phenomenon and hence unsymbolic. And if it were altogether unreal, it would be mere empty imagining, which, being related to nothing real, would not be a symbol either. Often it seems that discussion of Whitehead's symbolism, modes of perception, and symbolic reference are limited to the perception of sense data and the use and interpretation of language as symbolic. But Whitehead himself cracks open the door that will allow us to connect his ideas on symbolism to the imaginal realm of art, dream symbols, and archetypes, when he argues that broadening our definition of perception beyond strictly sense perception, quote, can be of no importance unless we can detect occasions of experience exhibiting modes of functioning which fall within its wider scope. If we discover such instances of non-sensuous perception, then the tacit identification of perception with sense perception must be a fatal error, barring the advance of systematic metaphysics, end quote. In order to avoid this fatal error, I will argue in this paper, first, that since Whitehead included aesthetic expression in his understanding of symbolism and was open to including non-sensory perception, we can connect Whitehead's symbolism and that of Carl Jung to broaden and enrich our scholarship. And second, that such an integration can positively influence human society's intensity of experience and our overall aliveness, vitality, and zest for life, especially when a practice of dream work is incorporated in this integration. So how is it that a Jungian view of symbol and a practice of dream work can positively influence process thought? Bernard Lee understands the difficulty of communicating philosophical and theological ideas because they typically include technical aspects which distance them from the general populace. He sees this as regrettable, though somewhat unavoidable, and writes that if neither Sartre's being and nothingness nor Heidegger's being and time could ever be part of the bestseller list, then the chances of Whitehead's process and reality are, quote, infinitesimal to the point of practical non-existence.
Oh, darn.
Surprise, surprise. Bringing the imaginal perspective inherent in Jungian thought to the table could balance the heavy inclination in process thought toward concepts, with its emphasis on rationality and its intent to appeal to reason. In the early 1980s, David Ray Griffin edited a book entitled Archetypal Process, a compilation of papers presented at Claremont when depth psychologist James Hillman and other Jungians were invited to dialogue with process thinkers. Griffin notes in his introduction to this text that people are moved more by images than concepts. He continues, quote, "The Whiteheadian movement has been notably less successful than the Jungian movement in communicating its vision to more than a tiny percentage of the populace. Whitehead pointed out that it is more important a proposition be interesting than that it be true, because unless it is interesting, thereby becoming a lure for feeling, no one will care whether it is true. Although we may," and this is Griffin still, "although we may have rationalized our ineffectiveness by telling ourselves that we were casting pearls before swine, we were actually, to use another New Testament image, giving hungry people stones in the form of indigestible concepts." So let's take a look at some of these indigestible concepts, beginning with Whitehead's view of perception, sense, and sense data. Whitehead agreed with David Hume that our sense perceptions and the things themselves are not one and the same, but Whitehead described two modes of perception, presentational immediacy and causal efficacy. Whitehead's world is organically interrelated and one which enters causally into every new entity. In the mode of causal efficacy, there is, quote, a direct perception of those antecedent actual occasions which are causally efficacious, both for the percipient and for the related events in the presented locus, end quote. In other words, entities can directly prehend those other entities by which they have been causally influenced because there is an ingression or participation of those influences. This, for Whitehead, was the primordial mode of perception, whereas it is through presentational immediacy that we perceive things through our senses. The interplay between Whitehead's two modes of perception is what he called symbolic reference. And this reference requires there to be common ground between what is being perceived and what is doing the perceiving. In Whitehead's system, as in Paul Tillich's theology, the reason a symbol can function as a symbol is because it is both an element of our psyche or consciousness, yet at the same time, quote, participates in the reality to which it gives access. This participation is what Whitehead termed symbolic reference. In a particularly interesting passage in Process and Reality, Whitehead explains that symbolic reference is one of the principles that govern all symbolism. It requires that there be two kinds of percepta, and that they must be correlated through some kind of common ground. Quote, "Then there is symbolic reference between the two species, when the perception of a member of one species evokes its correlate in the other species and precipitates upon this correlate the fusion of feelings, emotions, and derivate actions which belong to either of the pair of correlates and which are also enhanced by this correlation. The species from which the symbolic reference starts is called the species of symbols, and the species with which it ends is called the species of meanings. But how is it that we can connect the dots between how Whitehead uses the word symbol and how Jung uses the word symbol, meaning the images that carry such numinosity and feeling that they appear in dreams, myth, and serve as transformers of psychic energy? In both Adventures of Ideas and Symbolism, Whitehead links symbol to art, music, play, poetic literature, and ceremonial clothing, smells, and visual appearances. In other words, the symbols of creative expression and religion. In his discussion of appearance and reality in Adventures of Ideas, he writes that music introduces, quote, an emotional clothing which changes the dim objective reality into a clear appearance matching the subjective form provided for its prehension. Art is said to spring from both physical and purely imaginative origins and to be a sublimation of the simple craving to enjoy freely the vividness of life. It has a, quote, curative function and reveals, quote, intimate absolute truth regarding the nature of things, end quote. In Jung's psychology, the psyche mediates all experience and has various elements, including the personal conscious ego and the personal unconscious, with its elements of which we are often unaware until they are brought to consciousness through inner work. Jung differentiated between the personal and collective unconscious and concluded that there was a transpersonal or collective nature to the broader unconscious because he noted that very similar myth motifs and images emerged in disparate cultures and places across the globe. Because of his repeated observations of patients who, independent of their personal experience or history, related psychic contents with common myth motifs, Jung concluded that these contents did not originate in the space-time world or the individual consciousness. He was compelled then to assume that there were some kind of myth-forming structural elements in the unconscious psyche which produced out of themselves revivals of these mythologems independent of all tradition. Jung called these structural elements archetypes, meaning a pre-existent form, an organizing principle in the collective unconscious. In process thought, the term applied to the idea of pre-existing forms is eternal objects, a term that seems to incorporate at least some of the same ideas as Jung's archetypes. It might be said that not all eternal objects are archetypes, but that the archetypes, as understood by Jung, are contained within Whitehead's realm of eternal objects. In Whitehead's philosophy, eternal objects come into play through the mental pole. There are two phases in the work of the mental pole. Whitehead calls the first conceptual reproduction, and this is where eternal objects are forming the data. The second phase is conceptual reversion, and it is in this phase that novelty is conceptually felt. Here, subjective form is enriched, and the presence of contrast increases the intensity of the experience. One indication of the resonance between Whitehead's eternal objects and Jung's archetypes is apparent when we examine two passages about mathematics. In Science and the Modern World, Whitehead writes, and this is a long quote, "On the side of philosophy, Pythagoras started a discussion which has agitated thinkers ever since. He asked, what is the status of mathematical entities, such as numbers, for example, in the realm of things? The number 2, for example, is in some sense exempt from the flux of time and the necessity of positions in space, yet it is involved in the real world. Pythagoras is said to have taught that the mathematical entities, such as numbers and shapes, were the ultimate stuff out of which the real entities of our perceptual experience are constructed. Undoubtedly, he had hit upon a philosophical notion of considerable importance, a notion which has a long history and which has moved the minds of men and has even entered into Christian theology. The Platonic world of ideas is the refined, revised form of the Pythagorean doctrine that number lies at the base of the real world." In an eerily similar way, Marie-Louise von Franz, an analyst and student of Jung, had this to say in a chapter on science and the unconscious in Man and His Symbols, a text edited by Jung just prior to his death in 1961. And she writes, among the many mathematical primary intuitions, or a priori ideas, the natural numbers seem psychologically the most interesting. Viewed from a psychological angle, they must certainly be archetypal representations, for we are forced to think about them in certain definite ways. Nobody, for instance, can deny that 2 is the only existing even primary number, even if he has never thought about it consciously before. In other words, numbers are not concepts consciously invented by humans for purposes of calculation. They are spontaneous and autonomous products of the unconscious. Even if we strip outer objects of all such qualities as color, temperature, size, etc., there still remains their manyness or special multiplicity. Yet these same numbers are also just as indisputably part of our own mental setup, abstract concepts that we can study without looking at outer objects. Numbers thus appear to be a tangible connection between the spheres of matter and psyche. As was already noted, symbols are the linchpin between Whitehead's two modes of perception because of symbolic reference. They are both present in the psyche and participate in that toward which they point. Walter Shelburne, drawing from Jung, stresses that archetypal images are symbols because of their living intensity. He writes, "The archetypal images are not abstract intellectual concepts, but symbols which are not transparent to reason and the intellect. Moreover, these symbols have a certain aura of fascination. They appeal not only to the intellect as puzzles for the understanding, but to the emotions as well. They are as much feelings as thoughts. This characteristic quality of the symbol to evoke emotion is termed its numinosity, the numen being the specific energy of the archetypes." This sense that archetypal images or symbols evoke feeling or numinosity leads us directly into the Whiteheadian notion of prehensions or lures for feeling. Lee links positive prehensions to feelings, and Whitehead describes God as, quote, "the lure for feeling, the eternal urge of desire." Similarly, Gerald H. Slusser reminds us in Archetypal Process that, quote, "a truly living symbol compels unconscious participation and has a life-giving and life-enhancing effect." This is all related to what Whitehead calls subjective form. Subjective form is determined by the mental pole, and it is this subjective form which carries emotion and purpose. When a feeling has the datum of an eternal object, it is known as a conceptual feeling, and it is then a determinant of the character of the concressing entity. Feeling, emotion, and purpose are important to the process of concretion, and that which is a datum for feeling has a unity as felt. Whitehead considered feeling to be an essential doctrine in the philosophy of organism because the primary function of a proposition is to be relevant as a lure for feeling. The subjective aim, which controls the becoming of a subject, is that subject feeling a proposition with the subjective form of purpose to realize it in that process of self-creation. So why bother with all of this? In process thought, every drop of experience or actual entity makes a decision that constitutes its own definiteness in relation to some kind of aim. Otherwise, there would be random chaos rather than meaning in existence. If the end was determined strictly by the past, then there would be no actual freedom. Rather, the end actually comes from the future as a lure or possibility, and it is God who, quote, "so orders possibility as to render it into a relevant lure for each new experience," end quote. It is this lure, without coercion, that constitutes there even being a decision, and there is more order and direction and novelty in life than could be possible if all were determined by past or chance. The purposeful end or aim that comes as the lure from the future is called the initial aim or initial subjective aim. It is this aim that comes from the primordial nature of God and makes possible the commencement of process, and which therefore makes reality possible. Lee, the initial aim is God's purpose at work, and it is through this aim that value, intensity, harmony, and beauty enter the world, which is to say that creative advance is the overall characteristic of process. Whitehead understood God as the organ of novelty aiming at intensification, and such intensity of experience is a favorable goal for societies. In sections 6 and 7 of his chapter on the order of nature and process and reality, Whitehead discusses societies of occasions and how they handle environments that are changing related to their degree of structure and level of complexity. He argues that societies that are less complex will be more stable overall, but will suffer from a lack of intensity of experience. On the other hand, societies that are more complex and more heterogeneous will be less stable and therefore less likely to survive. Ideally, a society should be complex while at the same time able to respond positively to change and to advance in novelty, yet retain enough order and stability to be able to survive and endure over time. But how can a society achieve this? Whitehead posits two ways, both of which depend on enhancement of the mental pole, which is a factor in intensity of experience. The first is through blocking out unwelcome detail in the variety of members of a nexus. And the second is by developing one's ability to, quote, receive the novel elements of the environment into explicit feelings with such subjective forms as conciliate them with the complex experiences proper to members of the structured society, end quote. Restated in a slightly more digestible way, one can enhance one's mental pole by improving one's ability to discern the initial aim presented from God that offer novel ideas appropriate to oneself, and then integrating and aligning with those initial aims during one's process of concretion. That member and that society will then enjoy more intensity of experience and be more stable overall as well. If it is true that God is aiming for novelty and intensity of experience, and if these can be realized through enhancing the functioning of the mental pole and aligning with God's initial aim, then it is critical to our experience of aliveness, of vitality, and of a zest for life that we find a way to discern God's initial aims for our lives. The question we must ask now is this: how can we better perceive God's initial aims and positively respond to and align with each initial aim presented? John Cobb and David Griffin link the initial aim directly to the logos when they write that the primordial nature, or logos, is present or incarnate in creatures as the initial aim in relation to which the creature decides how to constitute itself. Whitehead understood God's relationship to the world as one of mutual immanence and writes that, quote, it is as true to say that the world is immanent in God as that God is immanent in the world. In a way that is similarly evocative, Paul Tillich describes the relationship between God and humans in this way, and I'm slightly changing it to make it a little more, less misogynistic or, chauvinistic. In the human spirit's essential relation to the divine spirit, there is no correlation, but rather mutual immanence. If God were not also in the human, so that the human could ask for God, God speaking to the human could not be perceived by the human. It can be said that God as an actual entity ingresses into new actualities through causal efficacy via the physical pole, and is therefore immanent in every occasion. As well, the philosophy of organism establishes that the primordial nature of God ingresses through the eternal objects via the mental pole, offering novel possibilities through presentational immediacy or conceptual prehensions. Now we can fully weave together these threads: God's primordial nature and Jung's collective unconscious, Whitehead's eternal objects and Jung's archetypes, feeling lures and numinous symbols, and creative advance, intensity of experience, and the psychological process of individuation. For Jung and those that are drawn to his theories, it is through one's inner life and psyche that one has access to guidance or direction from that which is greater than the conscious ego. Dreams, according to Jung, are both a source of information and a means of self-regulation due to the self-balancing nature of the psyche, reveal hidden factors of the dreamer's personality, and are our most effective aid in the task of building up the personality. Yet even Jung remained mystified to a degree about the nature of the dream experience. He wrote, "I do not know where else to go for help, and so I try to find it in dreams. These at least present us with images pointing to something or other, and that is at any rate better than nothing. I have no theory about dreams. I do not know how dreams arise. I am altogether in doubt as to whether my way of handling dreams even deserves the name of method. I share all my readers' prejudices against dream interpretation as being the quintessence of uncertainty and arbitrariness, a bit like Whitehead's wild vegetation. But on the other hand," Jung again, "I know that if we meditate on a dream sufficiently long and thoroughly, if we take it about with us and turn it over and over, something almost always comes of it." Whitehead might very well agree, because he writes that the object of symbolism is the enhancement of the importance of what is symbolized. In a discussion of instances of symbolism, our first difficulty is to discover exactly what is being symbolized. The symbols are specific enough, but it is often extremely difficult to analyze what lies beyond them, end quote. He describes symbols as having unhandy meanings that are often vague or indefinite, but acknowledges as well that, quote, "it is easier to smell incense than to produce certain religious emotions. Indeed, for many purposes, certain aesthetic experiences which are easy to produce make better symbols than do words, written or spoken," end quote. Surely anyone who has maintained a practice of recording and working with their dreams would say that they are aesthetic and can be much more impactful than words. So if we return now to Whitehead's assertion that expression is symbolism, then this gorgeous passage from Religion in the Making gives us a beautiful sense of its possibilities. I will add the term symbolism wherever Whitehead uses expression, and this is an extended quote. "Expression, symbolism, is the one fundamental sacrament. It is the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. The primary expression, symbolism, mainly clothes itself in the media of action and of words, but also partly of art. Their expressiveness to others arises from the fact that they are interpretable in terms of the intuitions of the recipients. Apart from such interpretation, the modes of expression, symbolism, remain accidental, unrationalized happenings of mere sense experience. But with such interpretation, the recipient extends his apprehension of the ordered universe by penetrating into the inward nature of the originator of the expression or symbol. There is then a community of intuition by reason of the sacrament of expression, symbolism, proffered by one and received by the other. But the expressive, symbolic sign is more than interpretable. It is creative. It elicits the intuition that which interprets it. It cannot elicit what is not there. A note on a tuning fork can elicit a response from a piano, but the piano has already in it the string tuned to the same note. In the same way, the expressive, symbolic sign elicits the existent intuition which would not otherwise emerge into individual distinctiveness. Again, in theological language, the sign, Jung might say symbol here, works ex opera operato, but only within the limitation that the recipient be patient of the creative action. So extending Whitehead's closing metaphor, God is the tuning fork, the human psyche is the piano, the eternal objects or archetypes are the strings tuned to various notes, and the symbols are the notes common to both in vibration. With their profound capacity for engendering healing in the psyche, it could certainly be said that dreams are a fundamental sacrament, or as Jung himself said about our experience of dreaming, every night a Eucharist. Thank you.
So thank you. So Adam is up next.
Thank you. This is going to, in some ways, I think, continue some of the conversations that happened this morning. And that's because I want to, or in this paper, I try to take this sort of mandate of the conference seriously and try to think about the relevancy of this really short work in a contemporary context. And so I use this as an occasion to reflect on Whitehead's formulation of symbolic reference in the Barbara Page lectures, and think about how they can still have a forceful impact on our 20th century epoch. To do so, I will consider a practice that is one of the least likely to worry about its uses of symbolization, namely technoscience. My claim here will in part be that it is precisely for this reason that the practice's use of symbolism are worthy of our attention. I draw heavily on Isabel Stenger's recent plea for a slow science in the face of fast and competitive technoscience in order to expose how it is that we are in the dire need of new forms of symbolism. New forms of symbolism in today's scientific knowledge economy. Along the way, I also consider how Whitehead's notion of a proposition and process from reality makes a key intervention into this discussion and reinforces the importance of symbolism in the culture of 20th century technoscience. And I do this in three sections. And the first section is entitled The Idiot Scientist. In 2011, Isabel Stengers gave a lecture at the Free University of Brussels titled Another Science is Possible, a Plea for Slow Science. Right away, Stengers expresses her gratitude for being invited to give the lecture, given that many people might think that she is a troublemaker. And a troublemaker is precisely what she is, or it is in any case what I shall argue that she is. But to whom is she a troublemaker is the real question I will be concerned with here. Stengers wastes no time by taking sides with another troublemaker in the Belgian scientific community. In no uncertain terms, she explains that Barbara van Dijk is a scientist who was, quote unquote, sacked by the Catholic University of Leuven for, quote, having publicly explained and endorsed the action against genetically modified potatoes field in Vettering, end quote. According to Stengers, Van Dijk's political act of, quote unquote, civil disobedience was met with strong response from the Leuven authorities for immediate dismissal before any penal decision had been reached. Such actions are meant to send an equally strong message to the scientific community, namely that Van Dijk's form of resistance is an act of civil disobedience against scientific research itself. But to Stengers' mind, the real message that sacking Barbara van Dijk sends is that the primordial democratic right of civil disobedience is an act of violence against fast and competitive science, or what has now become the gold standard of scientific research. To say that there exist strong ties between scientific research and industry is not new, of course. For decades, historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science and technology have recognized that there is little to no barrier separating the work of scientists from the developments in industry. In the US context, for example, many scholars attribute key legislation, such as the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, to the emergence of the entrepreneur scientist. And this model of the scientist has also been welcomed with open arms in the European context. But what is new about the Van Dijk affair and is worthy of more attention is how the Leuven authorities vilify her actions. Crucially, the rectorate of Leuven denounces Van Dijk's actions because they were directed against experiments performed by what he calls colleague scientists. Stengers is quick to note that this justification makes it seem if the experiments on genetically modified potatoes were produced under scientific conditions that are essentially neutral and only incidentally industry bound. In other words, the rectorate's remarks pit Van Dijk's actions against the tried and true methods of scientific experimentation. The real problem with this justification is that Van Dijk was not acting from her position as scientist. That is, as someone whose job it is to make objections in order to test the robustness and reliability of scientific claims, but from her position as citizen. In other words, what's so troubling about this case, according to Stengers, is that Van Dijk objected based on knowledge that any other citizen could have acquired. But as it turns out, the concerned citizen is a subject position from which she is not allowed to object. As Stengers succinctly puts it, and this is a quote, her dismissal means that the Leuven University feels entitled to control its workers' whole life, and not only what they do at work, that is, in this case as researcher, and not only what they do at work, that is, in this case, researcher, end quote. The university resembles what she calls the medieval corporation, which means that, quote, the member of a corporation was indeed not a citizen, but a member of a body with no independent life, end quote. And as part of the university qua medieval corporation, quote, even when they act as citizens, researchers will now have to respect the interests of their corporation, end quote. While Stengers does not take her talk in this direction, it could be noted that the Van Dyke affair also vividly demonstrates what Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, along with Maurizio Lazzarato, Paulo Verno, and others describe as the transition from capital's formal subsumption to real subsumption. It is not simply that subjects labor during working hours, but they are laboring in all aspects of their lives, in their cognitive and affective lives as well. This new form of labor is what Hart and Negri call immaterial labor, and coincides with the emergence of what has been variously termed the information economy, the control society, or neoliberal governmentality. In this register, Van Dyke's workday does not end when she leaves her lab, when she bikes home, or when she retires for the evening. In all of these activities, she is laboring. This, it seems to me, is one of the crucial takeaways of Van Dyke's dismissal, namely that she is not free in her off hours to place the claims of scientists into contexts that may frustrate competitive technoscience, that make GMOs accountable to the many environments that they affect. She seems to resist the general conditions of work under neoliberal capitalism, and is in this way a troublemaker, or maybe even an idiot. I use the term idiot here not in the pejorative sense, of course, but in the way that Gilles Deleuze invokes it in Difference and Repetition. Difference and Repetition to praise idiocy and what he calls the Russian idiot. In Deleuze's view, the idiot in Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground protests what everybody knows. That is to say, what passes for common sense. The underground man, Deleuze explains, recognizes himself no more in the subject. This is a quote. Sorry. The underground man recognizes himself no more in the subjective presuppositions of a natural capacity for thought than in the objective presuppositions of a culture of the times, and lacks the compass with which to make a circle, end quote. Similarly, for Stengers, the idiot is, quote, is the one who always slows the others down, who resists the consensual way in which the situation is presented, and in which emergencies mobilize thought and action, end quote. Furthermore, and this again is a quote, the idiot demands that we slow down, that we don't consider ourselves authorized to believe we possess the meaning of what we know, end quote. For Deleuze, as for Stengers, idiocy refuses to authorize a hidden source of knowledge that transcends the situation. It resists the temptation to place faith in an arbiter who can validate and disqualify others' claims. The Russian idiot approaches a situation without presumption or a pre-given image of thought in Deleuze's terms, and thus possesses no mastery over the rules of government. Stengers explains that it is Deleuze's idiot persona and not citizen of the cosmos that is behind her cosmopolitical proposal in her multi-volume Cosmopolitique. Indeed, that her cosmopolitics might be confused with Kantian cosmopolitanism, or a state of affairs in which everyone might be a member of a world citizenry, a citizen of the cosmos, if you like, worries Stengers. Quote, this is where the proposal is open to misunderstanding, she writes, and is susceptible to being interpreted as a politics that aims at allowing a cosmos, a good common world, to exist, while the idea is precisely to slow down the construction of this common world, to create a space for hesitation regarding what it means to say good, end quote. The cosmopolitical refuses to give a definition of what is held in common and by whom. On the contrary, it calls upon us to abstain from answering on behalf of others and knowing in advance who those others will be. This is why the cosmos, she continues, and again, this is a quote, must therefore be distinguished here from any particular cosmos or world, as a particular tradition may conceive of it. Nor does it refer to a project designed to encompass them all. In the term cosmopolitical, cosmos refers to the unknown constituted by these multiple divergent worlds, and to the articulations of which they could eventually be capable, as opposed to the temptation of a peace intended to be final, ecumenical. a transcendent piece with a power to ask anything that diverges to recognize itself as purely individual expression of what constitutes the point of convergence of all, end quote. In this perspective, there's a very particular neoliberalized cosmos that disqualified Van Dijk's refusal to allow technoscience to answer on behalf of veteran potatoes. That she deemed the concerns of the field liberation movement worthy of consideration resulted in her termination. It is for this reason that Van Dijk, attempted to suggest, exemplifies the idiot persona. She is a scientist who slowed down competitive technoscience's march forward by entertaining the objections of those whom the market deems unworthy of making objections. In short, she dared to challenge what everybody knows. But if Van Dijk is indeed an idiot, she is a new kind of idiot, not a literary idiot, but a scientific idiot. Section 2, civilizing the idiot. Whenever Stengers characterizes slow science, she never fails to draw on Whitehead. In the lecture she gave at the Free University of Brussels, for example, she references the first sentence of the epilogue to Whitehead's 1938 lectures published as Modes of Thought. The task of the university, he insists, quote, is the creation of a future so far as rational thought and civilized modes of appreciation can affect the issue. The future is big with every possibility of achievement and of tragedy, end quote. Stengers is quick to mention that this future does not reference progress, but uncertainty. And this uncertainty is somehow bound to the promotion of rational thought and civilized modes of appreciation. But just what does Whitehead mean by rational thought and civilized modes of appreciation in this context? And how might they help characterize the meaning of slow science for Stengers? Stengers, again, is careful to remind us that what worried Whitehead about education here and elsewhere is the 19th century discovery, quote, of the method of training professionals who specialize in particular regions of thought and thereby progressively add to the sum of knowledge within their respective limitation of a subject, end quote. Of course, Whitehead is critiquing neither abstraction nor specialization per se. After all, we cannot, quote, think without our abstractions, and speculative philosophy requires its own methods of abstraction. Rather, what concerns Whitehead are the devastating effects of modern professionalism. It produces minds in a groove, as he says, in which professionals, quote, live in contemplating a given set of abstractions. The groove prevents straying across country, and the abstraction abstracts from something to which no further attention is paid, end quote. The risks associated with this groove are profound. Quote, and this is again a quote, excuse me. The directive force of reason is weak, he says. The leading intellectuals lack balance. They see this set of circumstances or that set, but not both sets together. The task of coordination is left to those who lack either the force of the character to succeed in some definite field, end quote. Whitehead warns us that this nearly ubiquitous habit of modern thought commits the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, or, quote, that accidental error of mistaking the abstract for the concrete, end quote. One of the central tasks of his speculative project, of course, is to devise rational and civilized modes of thought that resist this tendency, that, as he says in The Conflict of Nature, that put all of nature in the same boat to sink or swim together, end quote. Whitehead was, however, particularly worried about the vulnerability of scientific education to this fallacy. The modern chemist, he explains, quote, is likely to be weak in zoology, weaker still in his knowledge of the Elizabethan drama, and completely ignorant of the principles of rhythm and English versification. Of course, I'm speaking of general tendencies, for chemists are no worse than engineers or mathematicians. Effective knowledge is professionalized knowledge, supported by a restricted acquaintance with useful subjects subservient to it, end quote. In short, professional knowledge runs counter to civilized knowledge, where the latter references knowledge that, quote, surveys the world with some large generality of understanding, end quote. The professional's, quote, and this is again a quote, restricted acquaintance with useful subjects subservient to it fundamentally lacks the balance that civilized modes of appreciation cultivate. Much of what propels this imbalance is a scientist's belief in the finite fact. It is a myth, Whitehead insists, which neglects to take into consideration, quote, the environmental coordination requisite for its existence. This environment, thus coordinated, is the whole universe in its perspective to that fact, end quote. In other words, professional knowledge, which Whitehead also calls effective knowledge, is incapable of addressing itself to its environment, which, quote, in its totality, we are unable to define. That we can never know this environment's totality is crucial for Whitehead, inasmuch it indicates there is always an uncertainty or an interstice in our understanding of the relations into which a fact enters. A fact has an incalculable number of environments and is prehended by them in an incalculable number of ways. This uncertainty, which is the same uncertainty, I believe, that Whitehead champions in university education, is what is denied to the professional. Whitehead laments that, quote, the rate of progress in such an individual human being, the professional, of ordinary length of life, will be called upon to face novel situations which find no parallel in the past. The fixed person for the fixed duties, who in older societies was such a godsend, in the future will be a public danger, end quote. What concerns Whitehead is that the rate at which knowledge is professionalized seems to correspond to the rate at which its environmental coordination is neglected. How, for example, an abstraction is supported or undermined by the way in which it is incorporated into other environments is negligible to the professional. Professionalism fails to account for the fact that, quote, every society requires a wider social environment, which, quote, leads to the distinction that a society may be more or less stabilized in reference to certain sorts of changes in that environment. Let's quote from Process of Reality, of course, end quote. It is the professional's disregard for this ecological fragility that makes him a public danger in Whitehead's view. Arguably, professionalism has only gotten worse and not better in Whitehead's time. Although he could not have foreseen the extent to which the sciences would professionalize, Whitehead's early intuitions about professionalism seem to anticipate the bewildering number of scientific specializations today. Nanotechnology, synthetic biology, bioinformatics, genetic engineering, and so on. These are all technosciences that did not exist in Whitehead's day, but they are growing and adding subfields at an unprecedented rate. Add to this that there is such a profound disconnection between scientific and humanistic education in the university today, it seems that Whitehead's worst fears have been realized. It could be argued, of course, that I'm overstating the case a bit. For example, anyone familiar with technoscience today knows that collaboration is the name of the game. Quantum physicists are collaborating with engineers in nanotechnology. Genomics researchers and computer scientists are producing stunning data visualizations together. Electrical engineers are teaming up with synthetic biologists to create biological circuits. Designers and architects are even weighing in on the redesign of living systems in synthetic biology. And humanities centers around the country are keeping abreast of developments in technosciences. So if these collaborations and others like them are now the rule rather than the exception, aren't Whitehead's concerns about the future of education misguided? Or in any case, aren't we already championing the kind of cross-pollination that invigorated Whitehead's thought and is key to cultivating civilized modes of appreciation? It is at this stage that Sanders's insights on the culture of scientific knowledge in the 21st century are crucial. We must not forget, she insists, that the reliability of a scientific claim does not depend upon its objectivity, but springs from what she calls competent colleagues, whose job it is to raise objections, to ensure that the claim has been submitted to demanding tests. It is the shared concern among scientists that a claim is reliable in the face of shifting environments that justifies exposure to harsh objections from colleagues from a variety of expertise. What characterizes the climate of technoscience today, however, is the loss of these passionate objectors who guarantee the reliability of scientific claims. Scientists, she argues, are now bound by the interests of industry, which means that the interests of scientists are already settled interests. In other words, the reliability of the claims and products of competitive technoscience are relative to the purified environments from which objections to them have been made. And these environments are ones that now serve market interests. Thus, today's collaborations in technoscience do not have the same meaning as Whitehead's civilized modes of appreciation. If anything, these collaborations express the fact that minds are in a groove, more so now than ever before. Indeed, there is a sweeping reduction of all interest to a common measure, market rationalism. Scientific minds, we might say, are in a neoliberal groove. What this means is that objections that are made from outside this common measure, if it is even possible to secure such a position today, are disqualified. They are messy complications that must be reduced, silenced, and abstracted from. The Van Dyke affair is just such a messy complication. She posed an objection from a space where objections are not tolerated. For this reason, she has been turned into an enemy of science. What worries Stengers is that by abstracting from this mess, fast and competitive technoscience lacks the balance of civilized knowledge, and this puts scientific reliability itself at risk. The claims and products of technoscience are circumscribed by one sphere of value. Products developed in synthetic biology labs, such as novel enzymes for biofuels, are made with an eye to competitive markets and with little regard for how they may have negative effects on the global food supply, for example. For a concerned scientist to raise an objection about global food supply to working synthetic biologists is to slow things down. It is to risk one's career. It is to be an idiot. Section 3, the idiot's proposition. What the above discussion makes clear is that the products of technoscience have an incredibly limited sphere of meaning for professionals who work in the field. Their value rests on the markets that they generate. In short, their meaning is circumscribed by the symbolic codes of neoliberal production. Given this, the central provocation of my talk is that 21st century technoscience is in dire need of new kinds of symbolism. Thus, if Whitehead's 1927 lectures at the University of Virginia still resonate for us today, as I claim they should, it is not only because they showcase the absolutely central role that symbolic reference plays in human and non-human perception, but it's also because they are a crucial touchstone for understanding how it is possible to generate meaning outside of the scientist's neoliberal groove. Whitehead is careful to point out in his lectures that not every epoch values symbolism, and that some epochs have even tried to get rid of it altogether. With the Reformation, quote, for example, men tried to dispense symbols as fond things vainly invented and concentrated on their direct apprehension of the ultimate facts, end quote. Indeed, quote, the very fact that it can be acquired in one epoch and disregarded in another epoch testifies to its superficial nature, end quote. Arguably, Whitehead's central concern in these lectures is to dispel the myth that symbolism is a mere accessory and to bring its constitutive role in human thought and civilization into full view. Quote, symbolism is no mere idle fancy or corrupt degeneration, he insists, and he continues the quote, I'll continue the quote, it is inherent in the very texture of human life. You reduce the functions of your government to their utmost simplicity, yet symbolism remains, end quote. It is with this in mind that we should inquire into how today's technoscientific culture can be framed in terms of Whitehead's theory of symbolism. And that's what I'm trying to do. This exercise is useful, not simply because it gives a technoscientific problem a new vocabulary, but it also vividly demonstrates where, in Whitehead's view of civilized science, alternative meanings come from, how it is possible to entertain new relevancies, and furthermore, under what conditions their verity matters. If there is indeed a scarcity in the kinds of meanings that we give GMOs, synthetic cells, nanoparts, and the host of other technoscientific creatures, then it is of the utmost importance that we investigate how it is possible to cultivate new meanings in Whitehead's view, even when, or rather especially when, they are regarded as idiotic. How am I doing on time?
Exactly 5 minutes.
All right, I'm going to skip. I have this whole section where I talk about how symbolism functions in Whitehead's, and we've talked a lot about that. So I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time and kind of get to the point. Okay, so I talk about symbolic reference, causal efficacy and presentational immediacy. And then I jump right into this idea that it is crucial to recognize, however, that presentational immediacy and causal efficacy, when taken by themselves, can never be wrong. They are infallible, and Stephen talked, I think, about this yesterday. Presentational immediacy is just what it is, the immediate and vivid presentation of sense data. And causal efficacy is just the constitution of the percipient from the influx of past experiences and so on. I think we all know this. But fallibility arises, and this is what I'm interested in, fallibility arises in the synthetic act of symbolic reference. Whitehead makes this point at a few crucial points in the lecture, and ultimately alludes to the fact that symbolic reference always risks being wrong. He tells us that, quote, symbolic reference may be, in many respects, erroneous. By this I mean that some direct recognition disagrees in its report of the actual world with the conscious recognition of the fused product resulting from symbolic reference, end quote. Later on, Whitehead returns to the possibility of error and notes that, quote, symbolically conditioned action can be wrong, in the sense that it may arise from a false symbolic analysis of causal efficacy, end quote. The idea here is that the act of blending presentational immediacy and causal efficacy, a mistake has been made. The wrestling in the bushes, for example, wasn't actually a predator, it was only the wind. Symbolic reference, therefore, introduces into experience the possibility of being wrong, but it also introduces the possibility of learning from experience. In this way, symbolic reference is always a gamble. But even error, Whitehead reminds us, must not be judged too severely. Quote, in the initial stages of mental progress, error in symbolic reference is the discipline which promotes imaginative freedom, end quote. In Process and Reality, Whitehead reinforces this view when he tells us that, quote, the evolutionary use of intelligence is that it enables the individual to profit by error without being slaughtered by it, end quote. Error is not always detrimental then, but it is in many ways, in many instances, advantageous. The possibility of error enables minds to escape what is given and imagine possibilities not already exemplified. The point, however, in bringing up this notion of error in symbolic reference is to draw attention to the fact that symbolism also introduces the possibility of there being uncertainty in perceptual experience. Whitehead is, of course, sensitive to the fact that not all organisms experience uncertainty as such. That is, feel that there is, uncertainty as such. That is, feel that this or that choice might not be confirmed by the actual world. But what accounts for the fact that I knew this was only one possibility for feeling the data? In other words, how do we explain the entertainment of different possibilities in the experience of higher grade organisms, a fact of experience that very clearly paves the way for the imaginative freedom that Whitehead champions? It's precisely in this area of conceptual development where the Barber Page lectures are less developed than Process and Reality. Thankfully, in Process and Reality, Whitehead carefully dissects how it is that we are able to feel sense data in a potential relation that have not yet been verified. He will call these feelings propositional. Without getting into the details of Whitehead's elaborate theory of propositions, suffice it to say that the proposition is neither true nor false in itself, but it is a hybrid entity that lures us into feeling a world that might be. More precisely, the, quote, primary mode of realization of a proposition is in an actual entity is not by judgment, but by entertainment. A proposition is entertained when it is admitted into feeling, end quote. The proposition is thus the could be of an eternal object or predicate with a subject for a concressing occasion. It is the propositional togetherness of subject and predicate, and not its actual realization, which defines a proposition. The, quote, germaneness of a certain set of eternal objects to a set of actual entities. That's how Whitehead also describes it. While both proposition and eternal objects have potentiality in common, Whitehead is careful to distinguish the two. Eternal objects are what he calls pure potentials, which means that they do not reference any particular actuality or epoch. Propositions, on the contrary, are impure in the sense that they always involve a particular set of subjects in a particular epoch that are put into a potential relation with a predicate. Okay, I'm going to jump into the conclusion. What I try to do in the conclusion, I say that the whole point of venturing into Whitehead's theory of symbols and propositions is this sort of, I've taken this sort of, anyway, the whole point of venturing into this is to say something about today's technoscientific culture, and in particular about the culture that vilifies scientists who oppose the meanings that, quote, everyone knows. In the conclusion of this talk, I want to suggest that Whitehead's work on symbolism brings a few aspects of the Van Dyke affair into full view. For one thing, it is now clear that what is denied Van Dyke is the possibility of entertaining alternative meanings to GMO production. In short, what she is unable to do, or rather she tries to do and is sacked for it, is entertain a proposition that opens up an interstice in the well-known and the well-worn meanings that GMOs have been given by industry. In today's technoscientific culture, the process of abstraction or propositional entertainment, which opens up the space of possibility and error, is foreclosed to scientists. To place GMOs in a predicative pattern that would lure us into feeling the effects of genetic modification in terms of the veteran farmlands places the values of industry at risk. As such, the sheer wealth of causal efficacy is eclipsed by fast and competitive technoscience, and those scientists who have not fallen into the neoliberal groove must be silenced. Their propositions are regarded as false and easily disqualifiable, since they do not conform to the true conditions of the world. Thus, when the Stengers advocates slow science in her work, I would also argue that she is devising the conditions for technoscientific products to become logical subjects for new predicative patterns. In other words, her plea for slow science is also a plea for constructing lures for feeling technoscience differently. But what Whitehead's work also makes abundantly clear is that these propositional lures, good, I think I can do it, are not materials for judgment. They're not materials for judgment, as both the history of logic and neoliberal capital seems to insist, but they are entities in their own right that lure us into feeling a situation differently. They are lures that expose thought to the wealth of possibilities issuing from the efficacious environment, but which have been denied to us by neoliberalism's firm grip on the scientific imagination. They are lures that make possible civilized modes of appreciation. In this way, the verity of Van Dyke's claim is far less important than the fact that she submits GMOs to new modes of entertainment. My argument is that idiocy generates the space for these imaginative lures. It slows down the pace of technoscientific production by resisting to give it the meaning that everybody knows. In this way, the idiot is the one who just cannot seem to get on board. Scientific idiocy is in no way anti-technoscience, however. In fact, it is just the opposite. Idiocy promotes the reliability of technoscientific claims and production inasmuch as it levels objections to them from outside the purified environments of industry. Idiocy therefore dares to cultivate civilized lures for feeling that, Idiocy therefore dares to cultivate civilized lures for feeling the practices and products of technoscience when they seem to be wholly resistant to them. I'm gonna stop there.
Adam owes a little bit to Sheri because Sheri was a little finished early.
Oh, did I?
And so you got the 2 minutes.
All right.
That was my call.
I could have gone longer, I swear.
So before I open this up to the floor, I wondered if the two of you had thoughts or comments you wanted to direct at each other.
Mm-hmm. I actually had a couple things that came up from your paper for me. One is just a quick tossing in as another conversation partner. As you were talking about slow science, I was thinking about ecofeminism.
Absolutely.
And I read some things recently, and I can't remember now which author it was that talked about this, but she talked about how, in evolution, species change over evolutionary time, and that one of the things that ecofeminism, one of their claims is that modern humans and modern science in this culture that we have refuse to live in biological and ecological time. And to me, GMOs are a perfect example of the refusal to live in evolutionary time. I'm sorry. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I think your paper points to, and it's not in the scientific realm, but it really goes back to what Catherine brought up earlier in terms of current events, is the idea that we can apply some of these thoughts that Whitehead brings up around professionalism to this whole problem we're having with police and militarization. And I'm thinking about, for example, minds in a groove that thinking, for example, that, racism is done, it's over, there's no racism anymore.
We're in a post-racial world.
Right, we're in a post-racial world. And where policing may be happening or may be conducted in a way that it's sort of like from the 1950s versus understanding this new world that we're in, and that they're not seeing the sets together of the environment within which these things are happening. So, for example, and pointing to this, I love this idea of the myth of the finite fact. Because I remember during the Trayvon Martin trial, the judge instructed the jury to only look at the interaction that once Martin and Zimmerman were face to face, and ignore all of what led up to it. And to me, that's like, again, that's looking at, well, the finite fact is this happened, and that's it. Or looking at only the whether or not Michael Brown was charging the officer. They're refusing to look at the environment which has created this interaction, what was said from the police officer to Michael Brown to begin with, and the fact that George Zimmerman left his truck with a gun in his hand. To me, he was the aggressor. So there's so much here, I think, that that relates to this idea of taking the environment into account and being accountable to the various environments that is missing in our current state of affairs there.
Yeah,
So
no,
just
I
thoughts on
agree
that.
with absolutely everything you said. I have no way to respond because I think those are great comments. And I think that my focus is on fast and competitive technoscience, and that's a lot of what my research is on. But I think what's really interesting is the way in which, and I address this idea of collaboration among the many technosciences and the humanities and so forth. But I think what's unfortunate, and Whitehead would probably say, is that there's a vast reduction, and that's precisely why we can actually see so many resonances between, say, what's happening in a synthetic biology lab and the kinds of reductions that are happening there, to what's actually happening politically right now, in these kinds of events. Because really, what it is what we're doing is this process of taking this myth seriously and asking it to answer on behalf of every other environment. I don't want to take up too much. Should we open it up?
Sure. Let's do that. let us open it up. 1, 2.
Yes. Thank you for wonderful presentation. So I guess my question is more directed to Sheri, your presentation. As somebody whose knowledge of Jung is not rather superficial, I've been struggling with the relation of subsumption that you articulated between archetypes and internal objects. Some archetypes may be eternal objects, but not all eternal objects are archetypes. So I think the distinction that you make between the two is based on the fact that archetypes are more like a universal across cultures and tradition. Maybe you can say eternal objects that are found.
Why do I draw that distinction? Is that what you're asking in terms of that some archetypes might be eternal objects, but not all eternal objects are archetypes? Is that?
And the criteria by which you make the distinction seems to be that the archetypes are more universally manifest across cultures and.
No, not really. It's more that that eternal objects, from my understanding, includes things like redness, or two-ness, or chairness, or things like that. Whereas Jung's archetypes are not. His idea of archetypes does not address those things at all. It's more archetypes are patterns of human behavior, or patterns of human experience, or arising of psychic experience. So it does not include those sort of really basic forms that also affect the rest of the world. That's why I don't say all eternal objects are archetypes and vice versa.
Right. At the same time, you seem to be saying that archetypes actually refer to the types of human behavior that are present across culture and tradition. That's how you would.
Well, he would say that there have been archetypal ideas that pop up in various cultures and traditions. And so he then, because he saw that happening, he thought that these must be things that are transpersonal. But I don't think he would necessarily say that every single one, is universal in the same way. I think there's always things play out differently in every context.
So he wouldn't go as far as to say that they are transcultural, or some archetypes are transcultural.
Yes, he would say that they are expressed in culturally specific ways, but they have influence universally.
The reason I'm keep raising this issue is that we find ourselves going back to the current events again and again, and this sense of symbolic reference repeatedly being made by police forces in the U.S. Perceiving blackness of the person in front of you as a symbol for a threat, evoking sentiment, a feeling of fear, perhaps loathing. Some racists would argue that this symbol of blackness would be some kind of a transcultural archetype, sort of proving the problematic nature of being black. And that seems to have been the kind of symbolic references that have been made through centuries in the U.S. and other places too, to the point of our behaviors, symbolic actions, having become sort of a reflex action. Many people, including some of my relatives, when they see a black person, you know the story. You could grab your purse or walk across the street. Have become reflex action. So to introduce any kind of new conceptual analysis that could free our response to blackness from merely being a reflex action into being genuinely symbolic action. That would involve some new lure for feeling or new possibility, alternative possibility of making a symbolic reference to break through the accretion that have made our response to blackness as a reflex action.
Which is why I think it's important that we begin to be able to discern God's initial aims and lures for highest possibilities, that we're not just stuck in habitual patterns, but that we allow for the novelty to enter through listening and discerning those initial aims.
Right, so there must be some religious dimension that could help us to envisage an alternative way of eternal objects or creating these archetypes. But as long as archetypes are, by definition, transcultural and universal, then we might face a counter-argument that blackness.
Yeah, I mean, certainly.
You find it across cultures. So why would people respond this way?
Yeah.
Because
certainly we could spend days talking about problematic areas of Jung's archetypal theory, and certainly many books have been written on that. I would rather not go into that full realm of discussion here, only because it gets into an arena that goes beyond the efficacy of dreams as a way to discern God's initial aims. So we can definitely have that discussion, but I don't want to take up as much time here with those aspects of it and how that all may or may not play out in the sense of universality. From my perspective, when I talk about dreaming, and I say that dreaming is a universal human activity. Every human dreams. Symbols are culturally bound and culturally contextual. I think there are some archetypal symbols that can come through in a way that is that people resonate with outside of different cultures that I can describe to you later. Some stories that I've heard from Jeremy Taylor doing some work with dream groups in Korea. But again, I would say that we always say in those of us who are interested in using dream work in this way that the meaning of the dream always resides with the dreamer. That other people can try to examine that dream in a way that they're projecting upon it their own meanings, but the meaning of the dream always lies within the dreamer. And the meaning of those symbols that come through in the dream always resides in the dreamer.
I would like to address my question to the gentleman. And I'm not a scholar, but I don't have to be a scholar to be here, I don't think. And I didn't understand everything you said, but some things really made an impression upon me. You were talking about the idiot. And when I go to see the doctor, I feel like I'm the idiot you described. They have, they have the vital statistics there, and supposedly they give you this through the body of knowledge that isn't questioned till about 10 years later, that you need to do this. And just recently, and I don't know if this has to do with what you were talking about, but the other day, some research came up and said that taking this low-dose aspirin for women of a certain age can be very dangerous and harmful to them. And I've been fighting the doctor for a long time. I just didn't want to take it. And so I'm thinking, see? But the thing is that this so-called research, especially from the drug companies, is just, where are the damned idiots, to protect us?
We need more idiots.
No, I think this is really interesting, right? Because it resonates in so many ways, your comments, because what I'm thinking about is the way in which we have tried to incorporate the idiot's perspective through personalized medicine, right? And this idea of that we can actually somehow be agents of our own welfare and our own, the medical establishment is allowing us to take control over this. What worries me, is that the idea of personalized medicine is actually the most insidious way of eradicating the idiot, right? Because it actually makes the idiot's position impossible, right? Because it personalizes, it individualizes it, and so forth, but under a very, very particular logic. And so I completely agree with you, right? Like, where are the idiots?
And I just want to add this as a final thing, is about, then they're at the end, the thing they really get you with, well, we practice preventative medicine here.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil.
Absolutely. Catherine and then.
I think I can see a connection between the papers. I might actually draw, but I wanted to say, first, Sheri, thank you for the courage of getting back into Jung. I want to confess, the conference 30-something years ago.
You organized.
I organized. So it was my idea to bring Hillman, all that.
Right.
I came from seminary thinking I would do Jung and Whitehead, and I went in a very different direction. And I'm glad of that, given that Jung has just been toxic for 30 years for any academic, but you're brave, and this might be
Blindly forging ahead.
might be a new time. And I just want because of increasing pressure against the reductionisms of natural science that he just couldn't map onto, and the ways in which he was dismissed were by and large fairly systematically ignorant of his actual text. The criticisms are by and large pretty valid, but the dismissals are not. But one way I think that it's helpful to read him is not to try to map the archetypes right onto eternal objects. So they're certainly, they certainly represent organized patterns of eternal objects, but everything that we can name does. So I think it's rather helpful to instead shift from the notion of archetype, which was his attempt to find language for something very elusive. And so he reached into Neoplatonism, as does Deleuze so extensively, but that's also been toxic until very recently. I think it's more helpful to look at the notion of the collective unconscious, which is what archetypes supposedly pattern and are abstract distillations of, and that collective unconscious is a dramatically helpful way of thinking about the way in which human symbols, human symbolizations of shared experience over millennia has always been becoming profoundly entangled, and that no individual one of us exists outside of that extensive matrix of mutual immanences over millennia, and that those millennia of shared causally efficacious experiences haunt us. And that language of haunting, of course, is very repetitive in Whitehead about causal efficacy. It seems to me the collective unconscious is one way that Jung gathered an awful lot of interesting data about for narrating the transnational, the planetary patterns of this. Especially humanly diffused, but for him also not strictly human depth of the shared past, in which our individualizations momentarily crystallize, and through which dream imagery travels. And I love what you're doing with dreams, and picking up on his notion of the symbol versus the sign as connecting the known and the unknown. It's a nice link into uncertainty in this radicalized way that science needs to take in, and only has perhaps really taken in through quantum theory. So let's just name that Jung's concept of synchronicity is thought in complete fellowship and intimate dialogue with one of the great quantum physicists, Wolfgang Pauli. And that Wolfgang Pauli of course didn't want that known, that would have discredited him totally. And that the anonymous series of dreams running through the 2 volumes on alchemy in Jung as a source of symbols for the selective unconscious, the most powerful set of those dreams is Wolfgang Pauli's, who had these archetypal dreams. Not to mention the Pauli effect. Anyway, never mind, that's another story. So, the theory of entanglement is behind Jung's synchronicity. The theory of entanglement, interestingly, is also imbricated, this will come out in my paper tomorrow, so I don't have to say much more, in the political philosopher William Connolly's recent espousal of Whitehead as a primary tool for diagnosing, exposing, and constructing alternatives to the neoliberal economy. So in his book, The Fragility of Things, he makes very interesting links between quantum entanglement and Whitehead, who he has just in the last few years come to know. Before that, he was more strictly Deleuze and James in his philosophy, but the cosmological relationalism of Whitehead is allowing him to link up the critique of misplaced concreteness to our vastly corporately propagated willful ignorance of the kinds of connections moving across multiple force fields, non-human and human, and now implicating us in vast looming disasters. So I think your use of singers here is very fruitful. My only real question, though, is: do you really want to absorb her her dismissal of Kant's cosmopolitanism, I would think that, one can again criticize Kant for all of his ethnocentrisms, but it is in that last essay of his that, on Perpetual Peace, that the ancient and quite radical notion from the cynics of cosmopolitanism breaks out again. I just think Derrida has a much more appropriate reading, and embrace the insight into cosmopolitan hospitality that's breaking through there and criticize what we don't need. And I just think it might help keep the idiot from becoming what the Greeks thought it was the original term, idiotes, means the private, and allow it a more richly political.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, where I'm getting this from Stenger's when she talks. I mean, part of the problem is that her cosmopolitics has been accused of being, or originally was like, okay, well, I'm getting this from Kant's cosmopolitics.
Can you hear that? What was it?
Oh, sorry. Stenger's use of of cosmopolitics, right, where she doesn't address it actually directly in her cosmopolitics, Kant's cosmopolitics. So in this other essay, it's called The Cosmopolitical Proposal, she addresses this question, like, is this coming from Kant's cosmopolitics? And she explicitly says no, right, because it's more Deleuzian in this way. But I think in recent years, there are people that are complicating this significantly. I can think of right now Greg Lambert. I don't know his work on the Perpetual Peace Project, and he's taking up Kant's cosmopolitical proposal in a very different sort of way now. And I think there are really fruitful ways to talk about, say, Deleuze and Kant's cosmopolitics in a way that doesn't sort of resort to which is funny because this is always what's always surprising is that Stenger's is drawing this line in the sand. It's like it's not cosmopolitics, but it's like, okay, well, under what conditions might it be though? Or under what conditions can we make cosmopolitics relevant in this way? So I think that's right. Seems right to me. Yeah.
I just want to say a quick, continue the conversation a little bit with Catherine about the Jungian side of this. And I just want to mention that for me, the broader project that I'm working on to integrate Jungian dream work with process theology is because I believe that this practice can operationalize process theology in a way that facilitates transformation. And for me, it's all about that. Like, where does the rubber hit the road? Are the fruits of this practice transformative? And so, again, in this larger project, the way in which, really the only way in which the Jung's sense of archetypes play a significant role is in his idea of the archetypal self, which the self with a capital S as a pattern of wholeness in the psyche. And I link that to the way that Cobb and Griffin talk about Christ as creative transformation, and the way that Jung talks about Christ as archetypal self, but not having to necessarily name it Christ. And so and again, going back to that image of the tuning fork and the piano strings and all that, if they're looking at this pattern of wholeness in the psyche as something that is connected both to God and to the human, and is the ground upon which is the location of this interaction that allows for us to be lured toward that wholeness and have this practice that helps us move through toward that transformation. So I don't want to completely eliminate any archetypal piece of it because of that archetype, but I definitely appreciate what you're saying about the collective unconscious being the ground of that, really.
And let me just say, we have a lot of interested participants, and we are at 12:30 when we're supposed to break for lunch. So I'll roll in.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay? So we'll start with Steve.
This is just a brief, it's been a while since I read the Stenger's article you're talking about, Adam, but if I'm not mistaken, I think Stenger's allergy to Kant, or to want to talk about Kant cosmopolitanism, has to do with the last section of Cosmopolitics where she talks about tolerance.
Right.
And basically what she's saying is that sort of liberal tolerance is a way of actually discounting people, not letting the voice be heard by saying,
exactly.
Of course you're free to feel that, and we're not going to stop you, but we're going to ignore you also. We're not going to enter dialogue with you. We're not going to take seriously your matters of concern. And so, again, I would be happy to conciliate what Stenger's is saying with the Kant essay.
Sure.
And again, I think the explicit way it has to be done is by taking into account Stenger's critique of tolerance is really a way of form of dismissal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's
So
right.
that's just a comment.
Yeah.
Nope, skipping over you right now.
You were first.
Or as
Okay.
Lucian Price says, Whitehead says,
Yeah.
it's easy to be tolerant until you've got something to tolerate.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I'll be very quick. You probably won't have time to answer this. I'll say two things. I think I'm right in saying, scholars help me, the only time that Whitehead really mentions the unconscious is he's talking about causal efficacy. So causal efficacy is it's not the unconscious, but it's the only time he uses the word unconscious. I just wonder if that fits in, matters, doesn't matter.
Oh,
What
well,
you're saying,
but I mean, I've, in previous work, developed, done a lot of writing around resonances between Whitehead's primordial nature of God and the collective unconscious.
No, I'm talking about specifically that the only time Whitehead
He uses the word.
unconscious, it's always in reference to causal
Right, and that
efficacy.
makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
Which links to what I was going to say to you in my very temporary attempt to make Whitehead a Marxist. When you were talking about minds being in grooves, great, I suddenly remembered that, of course, that means that bodies are in grooves too, because
Right.
I just want to say economic and philosophical manuscripts. To think about, our bodies in grooves in terms of the neoliberal, it's not just that we're professionally thinking in this kind of way,
Right.
but it's actually our bodies are
In a groove.
in
Acting
grooves
in-
too.
Yeah, no, that's great.
And now, last question.
Yeah,
Running out of time.
I might have some kind of linkage between the papers too, because Adam's, and I love your paper, Adam, and my paper is really in some ways, furthering a lot of those trajectories, but slowing, like a slow sign, slowing it down so the symbol doesn't automatically point to the action, right? But we ask about the meaning, right? There's this moment where we consider what is the meaning, which is the kind of rational slowing down, symbol rubism, right? And it seems like kind of dream interpretation is these symbols are such a kind of unique, right, sort of brand of symbols, right? They're such a kind of unique species, right? Because they're not, it's like they're quintessentially the symbol that's kind of, what is the meaning, right? It's a question mark, right? I mean, like, and dream interpretation is what, trying to figure out, well, what the hell do these strange things in my head, that come to me at night, what do they mean, right? And so, and there's this kind of therapeutic work of seeking these deeper meanings of things that kind of spontaneously emerge. So that's one thought, and I was thinking about, it's such an interesting thing because, on one level, so yeah, dream symbols, it is like an intermeshing of, they have presentational immediacy, right? They're sense data that we're seeing, like figures that appear to us in our dreams, right? But, and one presupposes that there's some kind of causal efficacy involved in generating them, like we're asleep and, our bodies are doing weird things and we're, and I do think that really the unconscious, it's really hard to find an unconscious in Whitehead. It's so much easier in Deleuze. There's tons of stuff that Deleuze and Jung can do. But with Whitehead, it's a little tricky, right? But it would be causal efficacy, because causal efficacy is the stuff that's like under the radar, so to speak. And in dream life, right, that stuff under the radar starts to generate this presentational immediacy, right? So it's really different than the way perception works. It's not things that actively work, right? But it is the same causal efficacy, presentational immediacy. And this weird phenomenon that happens where these certain patterns of presentational immediacy kind of spontaneously get generated in people, even maybe across cultures, and who knows, but definitely, so just like, I guess I'm just more thinking with you than the question, but I guess thinking, maybe this kind of thought, thinking about causal efficacy in the unconscious will cause us to think in more complicated ways about causal efficacy, right? It's not just this blind instinctual force, not just things pushing other things. The current causal efficacy is transmitting some really complex stuff, right? And we know that because it emerges in these patterns, right? That we receive a presentational immediacy. So I guess causal efficacy becomes maybe something that's a lot richer and more ambiguous, and a lot more complex. Something more like Deleuzian, like micro perceptions or molecular level. So anyway, those are my.
Sounds good to me. I like it.
Thank you. Now, we have one more question from somebody behind me.
Okay.
I threw it behind me and see who would catch.
Okay, so I have to be very quick, that's never gonna happen. So, what you brought up with so quickness comes from a unification that has no outside and no multiplicity in it. Which when Whitehead talks about multifariousness of the world, this is where we slow down because we cannot connect everything with everything directly, okay? And so in this sense, I want to answer your question from before and say not everything is political, right? Not directly, it's not everything is that. There's other things that are in this multiplicity kind of pressuring against it too, even if they are a romance, right? In this sense. Second point, I want to actually fall for presentation immediacy for a moment because it's also about aesthetics. So if I look at a potato, right, and it's just the aesthetics of potato, not the use in the context in which you were talking, it's really stepping back, becoming slow, and you need presentation immediacy in order to make that happen.
Right.
Right? So it's complicated. It's not just that causal efficacy is the good guy and the bad guy. Superficial. So I think that the cosmopolitanism is actually is more complicated by the fact that you have to take into account both of these sides.
Yeah,
Right?
that's great.
Thank you, everyone. That was great.
Lunch.
Catch you up.